腹なんか減ってるもんか。
食え。
Last episode, we saw how seriously Sanji takes wasting food. He asked the Navy lieutenant, "Can money satisfy your hunger?" It's a bit of an odd question, but behind it is an understanding that the lieutenant clearly lacks. Sanji references how scary it is to be out at sea without any food. The way Sanji feels about food has been attained through direct experience. We saw how willing he is to fight over wasted food, but in this episode, we get a better idea of how he feels about it in general. We see that Sanji is not an aggressive or violent individual. He takes pity on Jin, a starving pirate who escaped from Navy custody. After failing to hold up the restaurant, he's beaten up and tossed out the back by Patty. Without a word, Sanji brings him a plate of food and tells him to eat. Jin at first refuses, saying that he won't accept charity from anyone, and Sanji says, "To me, anyone who's hungry is a customer." When food is involved, Sanji sees beyond any external factors to recognize a person who is starving and needs food. Even though Jin tried to rob the restaurant and openly refuse Sanji's kindness, he persists and convinces him to eat. He understands the basic human need that drives hunger. He explains that this is not a gesture done out of pity or done as a favor expecting something in return, but an act of recognizing a person's basic humanity. When Jin finally eats the food, his tough exterior dissolves away. Despite the Navy representing justice, they allowed Jin to starve while in their custody. He was labeled as a pirate and forfeited all his rights, but Sanji cannot act with that same cruelty. There's also joy in the way Sanji views food. He is unable to hide his joy at hearing Jin call his food the most delicious he's eaten, showing that he takes immense pride in his ability to cook as well. This vulnerable moment is all witnessed by Luffy, who sees what he needs to see. Although Sanji has shown his ability to fight, Luffy wasn't a witness to any of that. What stands out to him about Sanji isn't his strength, but his kindness. Sanji even makes a show of covering up the evidence of him having fed Jin for free because, again, food for Sanji is not something that is used as a bargaining chip. It's a basic understanding that the world is a violent place, but that one should never completely lose sight of the humanity in others, even if they are enemies. Weaponizing basic human rights is something so vile that Sanji would rather get in trouble than allow someone to starve. Obviously, Jin will go on to lead a better life after being touched by Sanji's kindness, further driving home the message that Sanji was right to treat Jin as a person first. Or we might have to wait until the following episode when it appears he will lead Don Krieg, a dangerous pirate captain, back to the restaurant. To Sanji, nothing that happens after the fact could stop him from feeding someone dying of starvation. There are some lines that shouldn't be crossed, and when it comes to food, Sanji seems to know where to draw it.
同情飛行ってのかい。
おい、そこどけパティ。
Now that we know how unwavering Sanji is in regards to viewing food as a basic human right, we get a dose of reality. After saving Jin from the brink of starvation, he felt incredibly indebted to Sanji. When Don Krieg walks through the door, so weak with hunger that he can't even stand, most of the customers and cooks want to let the man starve given how despicable he is. Without a word, Sanji serves him a bowl of fried rice. But Don Krieg is not like Jin, and the moment he feels strengthened by Sanji's food, he uses his strength to attack Sanji and threaten the restaurant. He demands that the cooks prepare 100 meals for his crew, and he plans on claiming the Baratier restaurant as his own ship. With blood running down his face, Sanji turns and goes to the kitchen to begin prepping the meals. It might seem like he is simply following Don Krieg's threat, but we have seen enough to know that this isn't the case. Sanji would have made the meals whether he had been threatened or not. Although we still don't know why, Sanji has shown that he will stick to his principles even in the face of danger. While this is still a further study into who Sanji is as a character, I believe that Oda is also making a crucial point here. So often as kids, we hear stories like this that extol a message or a lesson, and the point is driven home by having things work out because the characters did the right thing. Nothing works out quite so neatly in One Piece. Sanji does the right thing, and his reward is getting smacked around by Don Krieg. One could even argue that although Jin didn't know what Don Krieg would do, Sanji and the Baratier restaurant would have been better off if they let him starve. It happens all the time. The world is an unfair and messed up place, and it often feels like we are all in a race to the bottom. Why act ethically and empathetically when there are so so many people willing to take advantage of that kindness for their own gain? For Sanji, the reason is simple. It's his principle that no one should go hungry, and he will act on that principle regardless of the outcome. Sometimes he is thanked, sometimes he is knocked down, but he doesn't act out his principles because of the results. He does it because he's recognized that it's the right way to live. In our own world, it can be scary to always act on principles. As individuals, people are often untrustworthy, but if you trust no one, more often than not, people will affirm your belief. Similarly, as a nation, one cannot claim to be the land of freedom and opportunity while choosing to incarcerate and deport people that you think might be a danger to you. Life happens one way or another, and while Sanji might find himself mired in conflict because he chose to act with kindness, he at least can be satisfied that his principles matter, that he is making the world a better place, and that he didn't allow the ugliness of the world to infect who he is as a person. In previous episodes, I've mentioned how Oda weaves stories together. Little by little, he is leaving behind moments that we forget about until it's brought back to the surface. This episode is the perfect example of the culmination of so many threads being laid into the gorgeous tapestry that is One Piece. And it starts in a moment of absolute chaos. Let's take it beat by beat. Oda has set up a pretty classic shonen anime conflict. The big bad man is threatening the protagonist's friends, so he prepares to fight. It seems like a battle will commence over the Baratier ship when the chaos begins. It starts out of the gloom, a small ship only large enough for him. Two flickering green flames are all that light its way through the fog. Hawkeye descends on the Dawn Creek pirates, delivering the final blow to their massive galleon ship, the last of Dawn Creek's fleet. Earlier in this arc, we saw Zoro's backstory. We learned what it is that drives him, and the tension was tightened by knowing the pain behind his ambition. He says himself that if this powerful man who wiped out a fleet of 5,000 is in fact the strongest swordsman, then he needs to find him so he can defeat him. Again, I've seen this heavy-handed foreshadowing in other stories where the final boss is set up with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It doesn't ruin the story, but it can be hard not to roll your eyes at this idea of overtly teasing a final conflict that might not happen until the end of the series. We see that this isn't the case here. Zoro was planning on going into the Grand Line to search for this man, but now he is right in front of him. Okay, so we have the main conflict of Luffy versus Dawn Krieg, the Baratier staff versus the Dawn Krieg pirates, and now, perhaps, Zoro versus Hawkeye. A perfectly reasonable amount of plots to juggle, but we're not done, as Johnny and Yosaku swim up to tell Luffy, Zoro, and Usopp that Nami stole their ship and their treasure, which of course, Oda was setting up since the first time Nami spoke to Luffy. She was always vocal that they were not crewmates, but merely working together while their interests aligned. Although she had begun to see the sincerity behind Luffy's beliefs and appeared to be growing closer with the crew, it felt like that betrayal was inevitable, as alliances held together by circumstance are only as strong as the chance holding those circumstances together. As the episode draws to a close, Luffy has beef with Dawn Krieg, Sanji still appears very unlikely to join the crew, Zoro is staring his destiny in the face, and Nami stole all that Luffy has been able to accrue since becoming a pirate. Perhaps it's unfair to call this chaos. True chaos implies randomness, and that is how this episode feels at the end. Yet when we look closer, we can see that there is someone in control, a writer behind the scenes, puppeting all that will unfold.
おい、何のつもりだそりゃ。
俺はウサギを狩るのに全力を出すバカな獣とは違う。
Right away, Mihawk sets himself apart as a foe far different from any of the ones we've seen so far. It isn't just his overwhelming strength, nor is it his aesthetic being much more threatening than Buggy the Clown. After Zoro saw this man cut a massive ship into pieces, he challenges him to a fight, and we see his struggle, not only to survive, but to comprehend how wide the gap is between him and the greatest. In my mind, the defining difference between Mihawk and the other villains we've seen is the challenge they represent. It's the difference between a goal and an obstacle. That's why it's so devastating for Zoro to see how far apart the two of them really are. Not only does Zoro lose, but he loses to the man choosing to wield a sword so small, Zoro refers to it as a toy. I love this fight because to me, I feel like it perfectly captures the struggle of improvement. I've wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. I studied it in college, I took specific classes meant to broaden my abilities and expose me to different work, and it might be rare, but sometimes I write something and feel really proud of it. And then I pick up a book by an author like Margaret Atwood or Ruth Ozeki, and it can feel like the ground is opening up beneath me, suddenly faced with a gap between my ability and theirs. But when Zoro is forced to face this gap, as Mihawk stabs him, he doesn't back down. It's something that Mihawk takes note of. Zoro says that he can't step back from Mihawk's blade because of the promises he's made. If he steps back, he'll never be able to reach the point he is at now. So death is preferable. Zoro isn't suicidal, but his ambition to be the greatest is so strong that death is easier to accept than defeat. Given how much I've talked about Luffy protecting his friends, it might be surprising to see Luffy hold back Johnny and Yosaku, allowing the lopsided fight to play out. Luffy knows something that Johnny and Yosaku don't. It's why he stops them from interfering in Zoro's fight. It isn't out of fear, as we see him leap into action when Zoro is cut down, but one wonders why he waited until Zoro was defeated. Luffy has his own ambitions that Mihawk tells him will be harder to accomplish than Zoro becoming the greatest swordsman. If Zoro can defeat Mihawk with his swords alone, he will know he's the greatest. If Mihawk loses because his friends ganged up on him, he will never know if he accomplished his goal. Mihawk represents the depth of power in this world, but he also shows the proper attitude for someone able to become the greatest of something. When he recognizes Zoro's potential, he doesn't attempt to cut him down before he can grow to be a threat. After he's won, he says, "It's still too early for you to die. My name is Dracula Mihawk. Learn about yourself, learn about the world, and become strong. No matter how many years it takes, I will hold the seat of the strongest and wait for you. Surpass this sword." If one truly is the greatest, or even has ambitions to be the greatest, one should not look to quell challengers. Mihawk sees that Zoro could grow to be a formidable opponent, and he demands it from Zoro. Despite the chasm between him and Mihawk, Zoro pledges to Luffy that he will not lose again, and recognizes Luffy as the king of the pirates. I don't know about you, but that gives me motivation to keep attempting to improve, even if the gap is formidable. It also reminds us that the foes coming from the Grand Line are not the same as those that we've seen thus far in the East Blue. It's a promise from Oda that the path for our heroes is treacherous and paved with opponents that have come before them and have grown to be monsters beyond the scope of what we've seen so far.
俺が片付ける。
たかがコックに俺たちがやられるか。
たかがコックだと3枚に下ろすぞってね。
Do you smell that? I think I smell a backstory. It's not in this episode, so for now, we stay in the present. As Sanji stands between the Don Creek pirates and the Baratier restaurant, memories rush back to him. He's younger and drowning in the sea, and Zeff's words are playing in his head. We hear Zeff's wish to open a restaurant in the middle of the ocean. There was more in that flashback, but for now, we stay in the present. It's a signal to start considering the relationship between these two characters. So far, it seems like the two of them might actually hate each other. Sanji refers to Zeff as an obstacle keeping him at the restaurant, and Zeff is quick to tell him to leave and that the restaurant doesn't need him at all. But we've already seen how Oda doesn't really write two-dimensional relationships. We're asked to look past the obvious first impression to see what is lurking underneath. The first thing to notice is this interaction between Luffy and Zeff, where Zeff asks him if he was serious about being king of the pirates, which Luffy immediately affirms. Zeff is impressed, saying that he hasn't heard anyone say that so confidently in a long time. Then Luffy asks if Zeff wanted to be king of the pirates, to which he answers that he no longer thinks about the past, he is happy to have his restaurant. Despite the fact that Zeff and Luffy are the ones talking, we pan back to Sanji, who looks uncomfortable. Yet he states that they must do everything they can to protect the restaurant, otherwise the old man will complain. The two of them make snide remarks back and forth, despite the fact that the two of them appear to be acting in each other's interests. The first thing that Zeff says to Sanji here that doesn't contain some sort of jab is this: watch carefully how he fights. Don't take your eyes off him until the moment this fight comes to an end. It was only a short interaction, but Zeff sees something in Luffy that he desperately wants Sanji to witness. The mystery deepens as Sanji continues to fight for Zeff, even jumping through flames to take on the Dung Creek Pirates' strongest fighter. Throughout the episode, we are left wondering what to make of this odd relationship where they both seem prepared to die for each other while also not being able to tolerate each other. All of this is brought to a head as Jin sneaks up behind Zeff and puts a gun to the back of his head. He tells them to stop fighting or he will kill Zeff. All of a sudden, Sanji is staring at potentially losing this man that he has clearly known for a long time. But we have to wait until next week to find out what happens between them. This episode was one that I definitely did not pay attention to on my first watch. I wasn't the biggest fan of the Invincible Pearl, and it felt like they were only putting off the eventual fight between Luffy and Don Krieg. Upon second watching, it's impressive to see how Oda is able to write these relationships that so clearly appear one way on the surface while having so many more feelings beneath it. They feel like real relationships. The whole fight between Sanji and the Pearl acts as a vehicle to see the depths of connection between Sanji and Zeff. Sanji is willing to die for him, but now he's faced with the possibility of actually losing him. Not only that, but Oda left clues behind as to what might be the root of Sanji and Zeff's issues with each other. We'll touch on more of that in the following episode, but one might ask what was being discussed between Luffy and Zeff that made him want Sanji to watch Luffy so closely. Hey, Ciano here. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. Make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you thought of these past 5 episodes. If you enjoyed yourself, consider hitting the subscribe button. WWLD, what would Luffy do? Thanks again for watching, and all I have left to say is